January 1944. High above the shattered winter clouds of the Reich, at nearly 25,000 feet, the sky is already alive with explosions. Black bursts of flak bloom, in tight, lethal patterns timed, calculated, precise. German anti-aircraft crews track their targets with mechanical discipline, their guns firing in steady rhythm. Another American bomber formation has entered the killing zone. One aircraft breaks from the pattern. A B-17 Flying Fortress drifts out of formation, its right wing trailing thick smoke. One engine is already gone. Another flickers with fire. The aircraft begins to fall behind slowly. Visibly wounded, on-grown German gunners mark it as finished. A clean hit, another kill. But the bomber does not fall silent. From its shattered fuselage, guns still fire, short bursts, controlled defiant. Even as it begins to descend, even as gravity starts to claim it, the aircraft keeps shooting, forcing enemy fighters to pull away. The gunners below hesitate, because the plane they believed dead is still fighting. And that moment would not stand alone. It was part of a much larger war unfolding in the skies above Europe. By 1944, the air war over Europe had evolved into a sustained, large-scale campaign of attrition. The United States committed significant resources to daylight precision bombing deep into enemy territory. This was under constant threat from ground defenses and fighter interception. At the core was the 8th Air Force, operating primarily from bases in England. Its mission: strike the industrial infrastructure of Nazi Germany. Factories, rail yards, oil facilities, and production centers supported the German war machine. These missions required heavy bombers capable of flying long distances and carrying substantial payloads. Aircraft like the B-17 Flying Fortress became the backbone of this campaign, designed with multiple engines and heavily armed defensive positions. These bombers operated in tight formations that maximized overlapping fields of fire. The formation strategy, often called the combat box, was critical. Bombers flew in coordinated groups, each supporting the others, with defensive machine gun fire. No single fighter could approach without entering the crossfire of multiple guns. This approach turned a group of aircraft into a mutually supportive defensive network in the sky. However, as formations penetrated German airspace, they encountered dense and coordinated opposition. German air defenses were layered and highly organized. Radar systems provided early warning, allowing ground controllers to scramble interceptor aircraft. Fighters from units such as the Luftwaffe Jagdgeschwader were vectored toward bomber formations. Their goal: intercept them before they reached their targets. These interceptors included aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf and the Focke-Wulf FW-190, both fast, heavily armed, and well suited for attacking bombers. Their tactics evolved, focusing on high-speed passage and head-on attacks. Coordinated group assaults designed to overwhelm defensive fire. In addition to fighter interception, bombers faced extensive anti-aircraft artillery, Kanon as flak. These defenses were concentrated around key industrial and urban targets, forming dense belts of fire that bombers had to pass through. Flak units used radar-assisted targeting and timed fuse shells, designed to detonate near aircraft altitude, filling the sky with lethal fragments. The combination of fighter interception and flak created a layered defensive environment. Bombers were exposed for extended periods as they approached, engaged targets, and withdrew, each phase presenting opportunities for enemy forces to inflict damage. Despite these risks, the strategic bombing campaign continued to expand in scope and intensity. The objective was to apply continuous pressure on Germany's industrial capacity. Repeated attacks intended to degrade production, disrupt logistics, and weaken the overall war effort. Each mission became part of a larger operational pattern defined by persistence and scale, and the constant interaction between offensive air power and layered air defenses. It was within this environment that individual engagements unfolded, often shaped by the conditions of formation, interception, and attrition. The effectiveness of American bomber formations depended on strategy and technical design. Heavy bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress, were engineered with survivability in mind. Their design incorporated multiple engines, typically which allowed the aircraft to continue flying, even if one or more engines were damaged or destroyed. This redundancy provided a critical margin of safety in combat conditions, where engine failure was a frequent consequence of flak or fighter attacks. These aircraft featured extensive defensive armament. Gun positions were distributed across the airframe: nose, dorsal, ventral, tail, and waist, each station manned by a crew member responsible for covering a specific sector. Together, these guns created overlapping fields of fire to deter or disrupt attacking fighters. The crew typically consisted of around 10 members, each assigned a specialized role: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and gunners. Coordination among these positions was essential, particularly under combat conditions. Despite this defensive capability, bomber formations remained vulnerable when isolated. The strength of the system relied heavily on cohesion. When aircraft maintained tight formation spacing, their defensive guns overlapped, creating a concentrated zone of fire that made it dangerous for enemy fighters to approach. However, if an aircraft was damaged and forced to fall behind, it lost the protective benefit. Once separated, a bomber became a more accessible target for German fighters. Interceptor aircraft from units such as the Luftwaffe Jagdgeschwader exploited these situations. Fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf Fw-190 were capable of high-speed attacks and carried armament designed to inflict severe damage on bombers. Their cannons and machine guns could penetrate aircraft structure, ignite fuel systems, and disable critical components. German tactics often involved coordinated approaches, with fighters attacking from multiple angles. 2 overwhelmed defensive gun positions. Head-on attacks became particularly common, as they reduced exposure time and increased the likelihood of hitting critical areas. In parallel, bombers had to contend with flak defenses concentrated around strategic targets. Anti-aircraft artillery units used radar and optical tracking to calculate firing solutions, detonating shells at altitudes where bombers were expected to pass. The resulting explosions filled the air with shrapnel capable of damaging aircraft. Environmental factors also played a role. At high altitude, extreme cold and low oxygen levels affected personnel. Crew members relied on oxygen systems and protective gear to maintain function, but damage to these systems could quickly become life-threatening. Within this environment, damaged aircraft faced compounded challenges: reduced performance, increased exposure, and the loss of formation protection. Yet even under such conditions, some bombers retained partial operational capability. Their defensive guns could still function if undamaged, and their structure could sometimes sustain enough integrity to remain airborne. This meant that even when an aircraft was forced out of formation and began to descend, it was not immediately defenseless. In many cases, it could still engage attacking fighters during its final moments of flight. This intersection of damage, defensive capability, and continued resistance created the conditions, shaping how both sides approached encounters with straggling or critically damaged aircraft. Human endurance. At operational altitude, the battle often began inside the body. Crew members operated where oxygen was limited, temperatures extreme, and systems could fail without warning. Oxygen masks were essential, but a single break in the line could quickly lead to hypoxia. Symptoms came silently: slowed reactions, blurred vision, and eventual unconsciousness. Despite this, gunners remained at their posts. Waist gunners were exposed to freezing air rushing through the aircraft. Temperatures dropped below 40 grados. Bajo cero hands stiffened. Weapons had to be operated with precision despite numbness. Injury was a constant risk. Flak fragments tore through the aircraft, wounding crew members without warning. Many continued duties despite injuries, unaware of severity or unable to step away. No dedicated medical support. Each man relied on his own ability to function. Psychological pressure compounded the physical strain. Each crew member had a limited field of view: tail gunner behind, bombardier forward, waist gunners to the sides. No one had a complete picture. Communication helped, but damage could disrupt it. Under these conditions, trust became critical. Every man depended on others to maintain positions, continue firing, and cover unseen angles. When a gun fell silent, it was immediately noticed not as a report, but as an absence. Endurance, in this context, was not simply survival. It was the ability to continue operating effectively, maintaining focus, and responding to threats. And when an aircraft became isolated, that endurance was tested at its limit. American heavy bombers were designed with a specific expectation: they would take damage. Aircraft like the B-24, Liberator, and B-17 incorporated multiple layers of redundancy. Engines provided propulsion even if one or two failed. Control systems, though vulnerable, could sometimes function partially under damage. Structural components were reinforced to absorb stress and maintain integrity. This design philosophy extended to defensive capability. Machine guns were mounted across the aircraft, each covering a defined sector. These guns operated independently, meaning other positions could remain active even if part of the aircraft was damaged. As long as a gunner could function and ammunition was available, the aircraft retained defensive capability. Records show bombers returning with extensive damaged sections of wings missing, fuselages pierced. These aircraft were often barely airworthy, yet they remained airborne long enough to return to base. This resilience influenced combat behavior. For attacking fighters, a damaged bomber was expected to be vulnerable. However, if its guns were still active, closing in carried risk. A single burst from a .50 caliber machine gun could disable a fighter aircraft quickly. As a result, pilots had to approach with caution, adjusting angles and timing to minimize exposure. This created a dynamic where even a critically damaged bomber could influence the engagement. It could delay attacks, it could force fighters to reposition, it could extend the duration of the encounter. The aircraft itself became more than a passive object. It remained an active participant as long as its systems functioned. And when combined with the endurance of the crew, this mechanical resilience allowed certain aircraft to continue operating beyond what might otherwise be expected under severe damage conditions. Tactical reality. The effectiveness of bomber formations depended on precision. Aircraft flew in tightly controlled patterns, maximizing defensive coverage. Each bomber maintained spacing for overlapping gunfire, avoiding collision. This structure created a defensive network, where fighters faced fire from multiple directions simultaneously. However, this system depended on cohesion. When flak disrupted formation, or an aircraft suffered damage, maintaining position became difficult. Reduced engine power, control issues, or structural instability could force a bomber to slow down or drift. Even small deviations created gaps. Once separated, a bomber lost the protective advantage of overlapping fire. German fighters were trained to exploit these situations. Interceptors like the Bf-109 observed damaged aircraft, assessing movement and defensive response. Pilots often waited for the most favorable moment, when a gun position was inactive or an approach angle was less defensive. Attacks were then executed with speed and precision. High-speed passes reduced exposure. Coordinated approaches from multiple directions divided the attention of gunners. Head-on attacks, though risky, targeted critical forward sections with minimal time in firing range. In this environment, engagements involving isolated bombers often became prolonged. A damaged aircraft might still retain enough defensive capability to deter immediate destruction. Its gunners could force attackers to adjust. Psychological dimension. Combat in the air was influenced as much by perception as by physical capability. For German pilots and flak crews, a damaged bomber represented a successful engagement. Visual indicators signaled effective neutralization. However, there were exceptions. Some bombers continued to operate despite visible damage. Their guns remained active. This created a situation where a target believed to be defeated still posed a threat. For attacking pilots, this required approach patterns had to be adjusted. Engagements took longer. From the American perspective, continued defensive fire had both practical and psychological effects. Maintaining gunfire reinforced control within the aircraft. It provided a sense of continued agency, even under deteriorating conditions. Each successful defensive burst forcing a fighter to break off confirmed that the crew could still influence the outcome. This interaction between expectation and reality shaped how both sides experienced aerial combat. A damaged aircraft was not always immediately defeated. A successful hit did not always produce immediate silence. Within that gap between expectation and outcome, engagements could evolve in ways that neither side fully anticipated, setting the stage for moments where resistance continued, even as the situation moved toward its conclusion. The formation had already entered the densest layer of defenses. Below, industrial targets were hidden beneath smoke and winter haze. Above them, the sky was filled with flak. Then one bomber took the hit. A B-17 Flying Fortress shuddered as a shell detonated near its right wing. The explosion tore through the aircraft, ripping into metal. One engine failed immediately, its propeller spinning without power. The aircraft lurched. Inside, reports came quickly, but without clarity. The pilot adjusted inputs, fighting to maintain level flight. Engine failure. Fire warning. Control issues. Asymmetric thrust pulled the aircraft off balance. The formation moved ahead. The damaged bomber could not keep pace. Its speed dropped. The spacing widened. Within seconds, it slipped out of position, no longer protected by overlapping gunfire. It was alone. Flak bursts continued. But now the pattern tightened. The sky seemed to narrow around a single aircraft. Then the fighters arrived. Interceptors from the Luftwaffe descended. A Messerschmitt BFE 109 approached from the front. The nose gunner fired first. A controlled burst forced the fighter slightly offline, disrupting its aim. Cannon fire still struck the bomber's forward section, but the attack did not achieve a decisive result. The fighter broke away. Another pass followed, and Focke-Wulf FW-190 came in from above, firing as it crossed the bomber's flank. Waist gunners responded, their fire forcing the attacker to pull away sooner than intended. The engagement tightened around the damaged aircraft. Inside, smoke thickened. Systems began to fail in sequence. Communication fractured, yet the defensive guns continued to operate, each position responding to threats as they appeared. The bomber began to lose altitude. At first, the descent was gradual, but as engine power dropped further, the rate increased. The nose dipped. Control inputs grew heavier. The aircraft was fighting to delay the loss. From the ground, the signs were clear. A damaged aircraft, trailing smoke, descending. These were the indicators of a successful hit. German flak crews marked the engagement accordingly. A kill. But in the air, the outcome had not yet been completed. Even as it descended, the bomber remained active. Its guns still firing, its crew still engaged, its resistance not yet ended. The engagement moved into its final phase. The descent accelerated. The damaged B-17 Flying Fortress dropped more sharply now, its remaining engines unable to maintain altitude. Fire threatened to spread further along the structure. Inside, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Oxygen systems had failed. Visibility was reduced by smoke. Communication broke into fragments. Each crew member operated within his position, responding to immediate threats. And still, the guns fired. A fighter approached from the rear. Fast, direct. The tail gunner tracked the movement and fired a short burst. The attacking aircraft broke away earlier than planned. Another pass came from below. The ball turret gunner rotated into position and engaged, forcing the attacker to veer off. Its defensive network, reduced but still functional, continued to influence the engagement. From the perspective of the intercepting pilots, the situation had become uncertain. The bomber was clearly damaged. It was descending. It should have been an easy target, yet every approach carried risk. Defensive fire remained active. Inside the cockpit, the situation reached a critical point. Altitude was falling below a safe margin. Structural damage increased. Fire could no longer be contained. They made the decision. Prepare to abandon the aircraft. Crew members began to move. Parachutes were secured. Positions were left behind. Some guns fell silent as their operators prepared to exit. Others continued firing briefly, covering the aircraft. One by one, crew members exited into open air, pulled away instantly by the force of the slipstream. The aircraft continued its descent. The pilot held control as long as possible, stabilizing the aircraft to allow remaining crew to escape. Only when control could no longer be maintained did the final exit occur. The bomber was left unmanned. From the outside, it descended as a damaged structure. Smoke trailing, trajectory unstable, but in its final moments, it remained a symbol of continued resistance. From the ground, the engagement was complete. the aircraft impacted. The result was recorded: another bomber destroyed. Yet the sequence of events had not followed a simple pattern. The aircraft had continued to defend itself throughout its descent. It had not fallen silently. It had remained active until the last possible moment, its guns firing, its crew acting, its presence influencing the battle even as it moved toward destruction. And that distinction defined the turning point of the encounter. In the immediate aftermath, the sky returned to order. Flak batteries adjusted their aim back toward the main bomber stream, still advancing deeper into German airspace. Fighter units regrouped, climbing again to altitude, preparing for new interception runs. The engagement with the straggling aircraft was concluded at least in operational terms. Within German reporting systems, the event was logged with precision. A bomber from the 8th Air Force had been damaged, separated, and ultimately destroyed. Time, position, and conditions were recorded. For anti-aircraft crews and intercepting pilots, it was confirmation that the defensive network was functioning as intended. But some reports included an added observation: the aircraft had continued to fire during its descent. This detail did not change the official outcome, but it stood out. A damaged bomber was expected to lose combat effectiveness quickly, yet defensive fire had persisted, forcing attacking fighters to remain cautious longer than anticipated. For the intercepting pilots, this meant extended exposure. A target that should have required a single decisive pass instead demanded multiple approaches, each one carrying risk. Defensive guns even from a critically damaged aircraft remained capable of inflicting damage. This altered the tempo of the engagement, slowing what would otherwise have been a rapid conclusion. For the American formation, the mission continued. Despite losses, the remaining bombers maintained course toward their target. The structure of the formation, though reduced, remained intact. Bomb release proceeded as planned, with payloads delivered over industrial objectives designated prior to the mission. Aircraft that returned to base carried visible evidence of the engagement. Damage ranged from superficial to severe holes in fuselage and wings, systems degraded or partially functional. Crews reported on flak density, fighter tactics, and points of vulnerability. These debriefings were essential, feeding into ongoing assessments of enemy defenses and mission planning. Within those reports, recurring themes appeared. Aircraft that fell out of formation faced increased danger. Damage did not always result in immediate loss. Defensive capability could persist longer than expected. These observations were not theoretical. They were drawn from repeated experience across missions. For the crew of the downed bomber, survival shifted context. Those who exited the aircraft by parachute descended into enemy-controlled territory. German forces typically secured downed airmen quickly, processing them through established channels. Capture led to interrogation and eventual transfer to prisoner-of-war camps. The immediate battle was over for them, but their actions during the engagement, maintaining defensive fire, sustaining control, delaying the final loss, had already shaped the outcome in measurable ways. Each second gained during descent increased the likelihood that crew members could exit safely. In this way, resistance was not symbolic. It directly affected survival. And while the aircraft itself was lost, the manner in which it was lost, continuing to fight until the final moment, became part of a broader understanding of how such engagements unfolded in the air war over Europe. As the air campaign intensified through 1944, both sides began to adapt in response to repeated engagements of this kind. For the United States Army Air Forces, one of the most significant developments was the expansion of long-range fighter escort. Aircraft such as the North American P-51, Mustang, and extended-range versions of the Republic, P-47 Thunderbolt, were increasingly deployed alongside bomber formations. These fighters could now accompany bombers deep into German territory. Their presence altered the balance of engagements. Instead of facing bombers alone, German interceptors had to contend with escort fighters. This reduced the effectiveness of coordinated fighter assaults and increased the overall survivability of bomber formations. However, the vulnerability of stragglers remained. A damaged aircraft that fell behind the formation could still become isolated, even with escort present. In these situations, the ability of the bomber to maintain defensive fire continued to play a role in delaying or complicating interception attempts. Each moment of resistance still mattered. For the German Luftwaffe, the cumulative effect of sustained bombing operations created increasing strain. Fighter units, such as the Luftwaffe Jagdgeschwader, faced growing challenges in maintaining operational strength. Aircraft losses mounted. Experienced pilots became harder to replace. Fuel shortages began to limit training and sortie rates. At the same time, bomber resilience required adjustments in tactics. Intercepting a damaged aircraft was not always straightforward. Even when visibly compromised, bombers could remain combat effective for longer than expected. This forced German pilots to approach with greater caution, extending engagement times and increasing exposure to defensive fire. The introduction of escort fighters compounded these challenges. German pilots now had to divide attention between bombers and escorts, often under conditions where numerical or positional advantage was uncertain. Coordinated attacks became more difficult to execute, and opportunities for clean engagements were reduced. On a broader level, these developments contributed to a gradual shift in the air war. Allied bombing campaigns continued to apply pressure on German industry and infrastructure. Over time, repeated strikes affected production capacity, transportation networks, and fuel availability. While not immediately decisive, these effects accumulated, influencing Germany's ability to sustain prolonged operations. Within this larger context, individual engagements like the destruction of a single bomber retained significance beyond their scale. They demonstrated the interaction between technology, tactics, and human response under extreme conditions. They showed that outcomes were not always immediate or predictable, and that resistance could persist even when the situation appeared resolved. And as both sides adapted, these moments became part of the evolving reality of aerial warfare, where expectation and outcome did not always align, and where even a damaged aircraft could continue to shape the battle until its final descent. In the vast scale of World War II, events in the air often unfolded in moments, measured by seconds, but their meaning extended far beyond them. A damaged bomber, falling out of formation, might appear at first as just another loss in a long campaign. Yet within that brief sequence of flak bursts, engine failures, defensive fire, and descent, there exists a concentrated expression of what aerial warfare demanded from those who fought it. It demanded endurance under conditions where survival was uncertain. It demanded discipline when systems failed. It demanded action even when the outcome seemed already decided. For the crews aboard aircraft, like the B-17 Flying Fortress, the mission did not end when damage occurred. As long as the aircraft remained airborne, the fight continued through gunners maintaining their stations, pilots holding control under strain, and crews coordinating responses in fragmented conditions. That continued resistance was not symbolic. It was practical. Each burst of defensive fire could deter an attacking fighter. Each moment of controlled flight could delay destruction long enough for crew members to escape. Each second in the air preserved options that would otherwise be lost. From the opposing side, German flak crews and fighter pilots operated within a system built on calculation and expectation. A successful hit was supposed to lead to a predictable outcome. But encounters with heavily damaged, yet still active bombers revealed that war rarely adhered perfectly to those expectations. Instead, it exposed a truth that both sides came to understand. Damage did not always produce immediate results. Between impact and destruction, there was often a window brief. Unstable, but real, where resistance could still occur. And in that window, outcomes could shift. The skies over Europe became a place where engineering, training, and human determination intersected under extreme pressure. Aircraft were designed to absorb damage. Crews were trained to operate under it, and adversaries were forced to adapt to its unpredictability. In the end, what remained was not just the memory of aircraft lost or missions completed, but the recognition that even in the final descent, a crew could continue to act, continue to resist, and continue to influence the course of an encounter until the very last moment.